Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Cambridge Digital Bible Research. In this video, we'll walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 12. These are issues that any interpreter of the psalm, whether they're reading the text in Hebrew or looking at a number of translations, is likely to encounter. And each of these issues impacts how one understands the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 12, the top 3 issues are the meaning of verse 6c, the meaning of the phrase بعליل לארץ in verse 7b, and the grammar of verse 8b. The first issue concerns how to understand verse 6c. The Hebrew text reads, Ashit bayesha yafiach lo. And there are 2 main ways to understand this line. The KJV translates this line as, I will set him in safety from him that puffeth at him. The ESV, on the other hand, says, I will place him in the safety for which he longs. Although these 2 translations are significantly different, they do agree at a number of points. First, they agree on understanding the first 2 words of the clause, Ashit bayesha, as I will place in safety. They also agree that the next 2 words, yafiach lo, include a verb, yafiach, plus a prepositional phrase, lo. And they also agree that this mini clause, yafiach lo, is embedded within the larger clause. Furthermore, these translations agree that the verb yafiach comes from the root pe vav chet, and that the basic meaning of this verb in the hifil stem is to blow or to puff. Where the 2 different translations disagree is on what the blowing or puffing means in this context. According to the ESV and others, the puffing is expressive of longing, like panting. Accordingly, the one doing the puffing is the one whom the Lord is placing in safety, and that for which he's puffing is the safety. And so the ESV says, I will place him in the safety for which he longs. The KJV and others, by contrast, take the puffing in a negative sense, as scoffing or maligning. Accordingly, the one whom the Lord is placing in safety is not the one doing the puffing, but the one who's being puffed at. I will set him in safety from him that puffeth at him. Or as the JPS 1917 translation puts it, I will set him in safety at whom they puff. The translation of the ESV represents a viable interpretation of the clause that makes good sense in the context of the psalm. The problem with this interpretation is that the verb yafiach does not clearly have this meaning of puff in the sense of long for anywhere else. Now some scholars will point to Habakkuk 2:3 as evidence, but the phrase in Habakkuk 2:3 is just as difficult, if not more difficult to interpret than the phrase in Psalm 12:6. So Habakkuk 2:3 does not provide clear evidence for this interpretation of Psalm 12:6. By contrast, the meaning of puff in the sense of scorn or malign, as the KJV and others have translated, is clearly supported by usage elsewhere. Psalm 10:5 says, referring to the wicked person, Kol tzororav yafiach bahim. All of his foes, he puffs at them, or he sneers at them. Yet in Psalm 10:5, the verb yafiach is followed by a bait preposition, whereas in Psalm 12 it's followed by a lamed preposition. When the verb puach and the related verb nafach has the sense of puff at or puff against, it's usually followed by a direct object or by a bait prepositional phrase, never by a lamed prepositional phrase. In light of the weaknesses of these more popular interpretations, we've argued for a third view, which some older interpreters have put forward, that the verb yafiach is not derived from puach, meaning to puff, but derives rather from the noun pach, meaning trap, and that the whole phrase means, I will place in safety the one for whom someone sets traps. This verb, derived from the noun traps, also occurs in Isaiah 42:22, and there are a few reasons to think that it might occur here as well. First, this interpretation of the verb makes sense of the lamed preposition. The noun pach, trap, is often followed by a lamed prepositional phrase indicating the person for whom the trap is set. Psalm 140 verse 6, for example, says, Tamnu ge'im pach li. Proud people have hidden a trap for me. Psalm 141:9 says, Shomreni midei pach yakshuli. Guard me from the hands of the trap they set for me. This interpretation also makes sense in the context of the psalm as a whole. Psalm 12 describes the wicked as deceiving and as oppressing the poor. Elsewhere in the Psalter, for example Psalm 10, this same kind of activity is depicted in terms of setting traps for the poor. Finally, there may be some support for this interpretation in the canonical arrangement of Psalms. Psalms which are next to each other in the Psalter often share similar language, for example Psalms 1 and 2 or Psalms 3 and 4. There are some connections between Psalm 12 and the previous Psalm, Psalm 11. For example, an important image in both Psalm 12 and Psalm 11 is the refining of metal. In light of the juxtaposition of and connections between Psalm 11 and Psalm 12, it may be worth noting that Psalm 11 uses the word pach, trap. It may be that whoever put these two psalms together noted the use of this word in both psalms. Now it's true that the noun pach is a geminate noun, from the root pe chet chet, while the verb in Psalm 12:6, yafiach, looks like it comes from a hollow root, pe vav chet, and not a geminate root. The hifil derived from a geminate noun would be yafeach, not yafiach. However, there's sometimes interchange between hollow verbs and geminate verbs. For example, the geminate verb tsarar is interchangeable with the hollow verb tsur. Each is a biform of the other. Similarly, although the noun pach reflects a geminate root, pe chet chet, it's possible that a geminate verb derived from pach could have a hollow root verb as a biform. In short, it's at least possible for the verb yafiach in Psalm 12:6 to be related to the noun pach, trap. And in light of the arguments given earlier, this interpretation of the verb seems probable. In conclusion, then, we interpret the phrase in Psalm 12:6c to mean, I will place in safety the one for whom someone sets traps. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale from A to D, A being the highest, D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a C. The second exegetical issue for this psalm comes in the very next verse. The Lord's words are pure words, silver refined, בעליל לארץ, purified 7 times over. The general idea of this verse seems to be clear. The Lord's words are completely true without any mixture of falsehood. They can be compared to silver that is refined by fire and purified 7 times over. While this basic picture is clear, it's not clear how the phrase בעליל לארץ fits into this picture. Some translations say silver refined in a furnace on the ground. Others say in a furnace made of earth, or in an earthen crucible. And still others say at the going into the earth. Most of these translations agree that the phrase בעליל לארץ consists of 2 prepositional phrases. The first is the noun alil with a bait preposition, and the second is the noun aretz with a lamed preposition. The translations disagree on what each of these parts mean. Specifically, they disagree on the meaning of alil, on the meaning of aretz, and on the meaning of the lamed preposition prefixed to aretz. The noun alil, assuming it is a noun with a prefix bait preposition, occurs only here, and so its meaning is unclear. The most popular view today among lexicons and translations is that alil means either furnace or crucible. This view goes back to the Aramaic Targum, which translated the phrase as bachura al-ar'a, in a furnace or crucible on the ground. Yet there's not much to support this view apart from the fact that it works well in this context. Besides the Targum, none of the ancient versions reflect this interpretation, and there's not really any etymological evidence for it. That is, evidence from the word's historical origin and development based on the use of related words in Hebrew and/or languages related to Hebrew. In the absence of any other occurrences of this word, or any consistent interpretation by the ancient versions, some scholars, dissatisfied with the interpretation furnace or crucible, have turned to etymological evidence for a solution. The noun alil, most lexicons agree, is probably from the root ayin lamed lamed, and the verb alal probably means to insert, as in Job 16:15, V'olalti ve'afar karni, and I will insert my horn in the dust. This is why some translations render the phrase בעליל לארץ as at the going into the earth. According to this view, alil means something like a point of insertion or a point of entry. If this interpretation is correct, then the idea may be that unlike silver, which is unrefined in its natural environment at the going into the earth, the Lord's words are pure as refined silver from the moment they are discovered. Whereas silver must undergo a process in order to become pure, the Lord's words are pure from the start, right at the going into the earth. This view is attractive because in the absence of much evidence for interpreting the word allele, it takes seriously what little evidence we do have, evidence from the word's probable root derivation. Yet this evidence, in our view, is too slight to warrant a departure from how most modern lexicons and translations interpret the word. The majority interpretation of the word to mean either furnace or crucible, it's difficult to say which is preferred, may not be all that well-founded, but there's not a strong alternative. For this reason, we've decided to follow the majority interpretation, represented in some of the best lexicons of Biblical Hebrew and a majority of modern Bible translations. So if we understand the phrase ba'alil to mean something like in a furnace or in a crucible, then we're left to figure out how this phrase relates to the following phrase, la'aretz. Does the verse describe a furnace on the earth or on the ground, as the ESV and others suggest, or is it a furnace made of earth, as the KJV and others suggest? It could be that the furnace or crucible is made of earth, and this may seem likely against the background that furnaces and crucibles were often made of hardened clay. However, the word aretz or eretz never refers to the material of which something is made. For this, we would have expected a word like afar or udama. This view also has trouble explaining the lamed preposition on la'aretz, which is not a normal way of indicating what something is made of. By contrast, the view that the phrase means on the ground or on the earth is consistent with the normal meaning of aretz or eretz. This view is also consistent with the fact that ancient furnaces were built in or on the ground. This is also how the Targum understood the phrase. But this view also has trouble explaining the lamed preposition. If the author intended to say on the ground, we might have expected the preposition al instead of the preposition le. Yet it may be that the lamed preposition here indicates a possessive relationship, similar to a construct chain, a furnace or crucible of the ground. Normally, we would expect a construct chain to indicate a relationship like this, ba'alil ha'aretz, a furnace of the ground. Yet, when there is a mismatch in definiteness, when the second noun of a construct chain is definite and the first noun is indefinite, lamed is used instead of a construct chain. Here the word eretz is definite, both semantically and perhaps also morphologically, referring to the ground or the earth. The construct chain, ba'alil ha'aretz, would mean the furnace of the ground. In order to say a furnace of the ground, you might instead say ba'alil la'aretz, as we have here. This possessive relationship might then be interpreted in terms of spatial orientation. A furnace of the ground equals a furnace which is on or in the ground. In conclusion, we read this difficult line as silver refined in a furnace or in a crucible on the ground. We give this interpretation a D rating, which means we think that this is the most likely of the proposed interpretations, but we have serious doubts about it. The third exegetical issue in this psalm concerns the grammar and meaning of verse 8b. The ESV and others translate this line as, "You will guard us from this generation forever." Other translations say something like, "You will guard him or them from this generation forever." Why do some translations say us and others say them? The question comes down to how the Hebrew consonantal text ought to be pronounced or vocalized. The consonants tet, sad, resh, nun, vav could be pronounced either titzreinu or titzrenu. The first pronunciation, titzrenu, would mean you will guard us. Enu is a first-person plural suffix. The second pronunciation, titzrenu, would mean you will guard him. Inu is most likely a third-person masculine singular suffix. So how do we know which pronunciation is correct? In the traditional Hebrew text, the word is pronounced as titzrenu, you will guard him. This is how the oldest and best of the Masoretic manuscripts vocalize the text, though there are some medieval Hebrew manuscripts that vocalize the text as titzrenu. The Septuagint, however, uses a first-person plural pronoun, which means that the translators would have vocalized the text titzrenu, you will guard us. This is also how Jerome, the Christian translator of the Bible into Latin, would later understand and translate this word. Many interpreters today argue that this pronunciation of the text is correct, titzrenu, you will guard us. Not only is this reading attested at a very early date in the Septuagint translation, but according to some it makes the most sense in the context. By contrast, if we accept titzrenu as the correct reading, you will guard him, then the identity of him is not clear. Yet the apparent difficulty of reading him instead of us may be evidence that him is the older reading. If the original text was pronounced us, titzrenu, then it's unlikely that, with such a clear meaning, him, titzrenu, would have emerged as a secondary reading. By contrast, if him is original, and the antecedent of him is not immediately clear, then it's easy to see how some may have wanted, consciously or unconsciously, to read the text as us. For this reason, along with the fact that the Masoretic reading tradition is generally reliable, it seems best to pronounce the text titzrenu, you will guard him. But who is the him? The previous line, verse 8a, uses a third-person plural pronoun, you will guard them. And it's worth noting that elsewhere in the psalm there's an alternation between singular and plural. Verse 2, for example, mentions the loyal ones, singular, in the A line, and then faithful ones, plural, in the B line. Verse 6 mentions the poor and afflicted, plural, in the A line, and then the one for whom someone sets traps, singular, in the C line. It's not surprising, then, that we see the same plural-singular alternation in verse 8. It seems likely that the plural pronoun in verse 8a points back to the plural poor and afflicted from verse 6a, and that the singular pronoun in verse 8b points back to the singular trapped person in verse 6c. You, Lord, will guard them, that is, the poor and afflicted. You will protect him, that is, the one for whom someone sets a trap. We give this interpretation a B+ rating. Now, while we're here in verse 8b, you may be wondering why our translation says, you will protect him from the generation which is forever, instead of the more normal, you will protect him from this generation forever. The Hebrew text reads, titzrenu min hador zu le'olam, and this is usually interpreted, as the ESV and others have done, as, you will protect him from this generation forever. This majority interpretation has a lot going for it. In the first place, this is how the text was read in antiquity. All of the ancient versions, and even one Psalms manuscript from Qumran, appear to have read zu as a demonstrative pronoun meaning this generation. And this interpretation makes good sense in the context. The difficulty with this majority interpretation is twofold. In the first place, the word zu functions almost always, if not always, as a relative pronoun, which or who. For example, Psalm 9:16 says, Bereshet zu tamamnu nilkada raglam. In the net which they hid, their feet were caught. By contrast, there are no clear examples of zu as a demonstrative pronoun. The other difficulty with the majority view is that if zu modified hadur as a demonstrative, this generation, then we would expect zu to agree with hadur in definiteness. We would expect hazu instead of just zu. So as it stands in the Masoretic text, it's difficult to read zu le'olam as anything other than a relative clause. The reason why so many interpreters think that zu le'olam can't be a relative clause here is that it doesn't make sense to say the generation which is forever. And we admit this is difficult to make sense of. It could be that the generation which is forever refers to the group of evil people who seem to have no end. Their generation seems to be forever. The next verse, verse 9, goes on to describe this wicked and seemingly endless generation. Whatever the meaning may be, it seems best to us to follow the grammatical evidence. We give this interpretation of zu a C rating. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues affects how we see the psalm as a whole. The psalm begins with a distressed plea for help, lamenting the fact that the loyal one has disappeared and faithful ones have vanished. Wickedness is rampant and the poor are oppressed. But in verse 6, the Lord responds to the plea for help. He says, I will place in safety the one for whom someone sets traps. Verse 7 then reflects on what the Lord has just said in verse 6. Unlike the words of the wicked, the words of the Lord are pure, like silver refined in a furnace on the ground, purified 7 times over. Then in verse 8, the psalmist asserts, You, Lord, will guard them. You will protect him from the generation which is forever. The Lord will protect his people, collectively and each one individually, from the generation which seems to have no end. This has been the top 3 exegetical issues for Psalm 12. Thanks for watching.